Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we are in Irouléguy and we're looking at the Herri Mina 2018 Irouléguy Rouge. Herri Mina was established in 1996 by legendary winemaker Jean-Claude Berrouet. If the name Jean-Claude Berrouet is not one that you immediately recognize, perhaps you're a little bit more familiar with the name of the estate where he made wine for 44 vintages, and that is Château Pétrus. Yes, you heard me correctly. From 1964 to 2008, Jean-Claude Berrouet was head of winemaking at Château Pétrus in Pomerol. Jean-Claude is a Basque native and he always wanted to have vineyards in this part of France. And the name Herri Mina loosely translates from Basque to the word nostalgia. Jean-Claude makes two wines here in Irouléguy. He has a white wine that is a blend of Petit Menseng, Petit Corbu, and Gros Menseng, and a red from Cabernet Franc. And Jean-Claude shared with me that he chose Cabernet Franc because, like him, the grape hails from Basque Country. And working with this grape on these lands is like getting back to basics or getting back to one's roots. So let me unpack this one a little bit for everyone. From what we know, based on DNA evidence, Cabernet Franc originates from Spain's País Vasco, that is Basque Country. And this area of Basque Country straddles southwestern France and northeastern Spain, and we're on the Atlantic side of the Pyrenees mountain range. And it has been determined that Cabernet Franc is the parent of two very old grape varieties that come from around the city of Hondarribia, which is on the Bay of Biscay in Spain's Basque Country. And these two grapes are Hondarribia and Morenoa. And the region of Irouléguy is in northern Basque Country, and this historically, this was the department of the Lower Navarra, or the Basse Navarre in French. And here, Cabernet Franc goes by the local name Akeria, which means fox. And the area of Irouléguy, its viticultural history actually likely predates Roman times, but the region's wines really didn't begin to gain notoriety until the 13th century. And this is when the monks of the monastery of Roncesvalles, or Roncesvalles, which is this little village on the France-Spain border, they had set up priories in the villages of Irouléguy and Gros, and this is where they were cultivating vineyards with local varieties. And these two villages of Irouléguy and Gros, they were actually on the route between Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and the previously mentioned city of Hondarribia. And all of these places were important stops along the route for pilgrims that were following the Camino de Santiago, or the Way of St. James, all the way out to Santiago de Compostela in Galicia between the 11th and the 15th century. Of course, during this time, bread and wine were important means of sustenance for those that were on this long religious pilgrimage. And while the name Akeria does not appear in historical records until 1903, it is very likely that Cabernet Franc was cultivated here and vinified into wine during this time. Now, thanks in part to the important port of Bayonne, the wines from Irouléguy continued to gain acclaim, not just in Basque Country, but also in important export markets. And this was well into the 19th century. In fact, around this time, the vineyard area in the region peaked at around 1,000 hectares under vine. Now, of course, with the onset of phylloxera at the end of the 1800s, virtually all the vineyards here disappeared. And in 1950, there was only 50 hectares under vine in this region. Now, today, the region of Irouléguy is thriving, and it encompasses 15 communes, and there's around 260 hectares under vine. The AOP was set up in 1970, and the appellation covers red wines, rosés, and white wines. And red wines account for around 60% of the appellation's production. Rosés account for around 20%. And Cabernet Franc, along with Tannat, are the two principal red grapes for red wine production. And either of these grapes must be a minimum of 50% of the red wine blend. And currently today in Irouléguy, there's around 50 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines planted. So I want to cover the sort of growing environment, if you will, of Irouléguy. So as I mentioned before, we are in southwestern France, very close to the Spanish border here. And because of this, we're obviously at a very southerly latitude, but we are close to the Atlantic Ocean, which is just about 40 kilometers to the west. So we have a strong moderating influence from the Atlantic, and this gives the region a moderate maritime climate. And the region does receive a relatively high amount of rainfall, about 1,500 millimeters of rainfall annually. As is typical with a maritime climate, the rain does fall throughout the year, but it is a little bit heavier in the winter and the early spring. And that gives slightly drier conditions in the late summer and early autumn, which is of course important for the latter stages of the vine cycle in terms of ripening. Another important element of the climate here is this strong, dry, warm, southerly foehn wind that blows through the region in the late summer and autumn. It's said that it comes through every third day. And this wind is known locally as the Aise Egoa. And thanks to this strong, dry, warm wind, this helps to eliminate moisture, eliminate humidity from the vineyards. This will help to reduce disease pressure, but it also, again, helps to create ideal conditions later in the season during that critical ripening phase of the vine cycle. I also want to touch on the viticultural landscape of Irouléguy in terms of how the vineyard area is laid out, as well as the soils. So as I mentioned, we're in the foothills of the Pyrenees Mountains here, and this gives us very extreme terrain. We are on very steep, undulating hillsides here, and there's all these streams and other tributaries that intermingle with the hills, and this gives us a very varied terrain with a lot of different exposures. And because of these steep slopes that we have here, the vineyards are all kind of planted on these steep slopes, and the slopes are typically around a 60% grade. And in most instances, the vines are planted on terraces here between 200 and 400 meters above sea level. And then, of course, we've got to talk about soils. And there are basically three main types of soils. And what soils we find where, it kind of varies because of this undulating terroir that we have. But in general, as I said, there's three main soils here. We have these red sandstone soils that date to the Triassic era. We also have these Cooper ophites that are of volcanic origin that also date to the Triassic. And then we have also some calcareous soils in and around the commune of Irouléguy, and these date to the Jurassic era. And all three of these soils have good balance between their drainage capabilities, which of course is important because we're trying to get some of this moisture away from the vines, as well as a good balance between moisture retention capacities, which is important for grapes like Cabernet Franc. So getting to today's wine, this is coming from a 0.9 hectare parcel of Cabernet Franc vines planted in the commune of Ispour. This is in the foothills of the Pic d'Ardoy. And these vines are planted on red sandstone soils on very steep south-facing slopes or south-facing terraces, I should say, between 150 and 300 meters above sea level. The vines were planted in the year 2000, and Jean-Claude shared with me that he's actually working with the clone 214 in his vineyards. This is the Loire clone, and he believes that this clone is the best clone for Cabernet Franc in terms of the viticultural characteristics as well as quality. Now, from a winemaking perspective, this wine is made very classically. So we're talking hand-harvested fruit, destemmed fruit here. The fermentation takes place in smaller stainless steel vats. And Jean-Claude takes a very gentle approach as it relates to the extractions. The wine stays on skins for only about 15 days. And then aging takes place in 1-year-old oak barrels, and the wine rests there for about 12 to 14 months or so before bottling. So let's get into this wine. So the first thing that immediately struck me with this wine when I was tasting it earlier was the perfume. It has a very lifted, almost lacy character to the perfume. And the fruits are really special. They lean a little bit more on the savory side, slightly sweeter, but red fruit driven for sure. And it's a bit of cherry. There's a little bit of a raspberry note here as well, maybe even a touch of a wild blueberry thing. And as I said, I think this wine leans a little bit more savory, and I love the layers of the herbaceousness that come through here. And for me, I noted in my notes earlier, wispy herbs, if that makes sense to anybody. But that makes me think of like sage, perhaps a little bit of tarragon as well. There's a little bit of an evergreen thing going on, like a bit of balsam. There's also a lovely floral undertone, which for me is coming through as like peony. And then there's also a little bit of spice on the nose, but very gentle in terms of the spice profile. Yeah, the nose is quite lovely. It's very perfumed, as I said, pure fruited with a lot of clarity to the fruit profile as well. On the palate, the same beautiful bright red fruits come through really nicely. And that spice comes a bit more forward, but it's very gentle, as I said. It's not like clove, which can be very pungent. It's more like cardamom. It's a softer, more elegant spice, if you will. And I like how the savory notes are coming through on the palate as well. Those wispy herbs, as I said, those soft herbs like sage. The acidity on this wine is very bright, very refreshing, and there is a slight bit of like a juiciness to the fruit profile as well, which I really quite like. What was really defining this wine for me when I was tasting it earlier was the texture, the mouthfeel, the tannins. And it was literally like I had the wine in my mouth and I didn't want to let it go. Like I didn't want to spit it out, I didn't want to swallow it. I just wanted it to move around my palate so it hit at all of the corners of my palate, because it was just something about the texture. And it had this silkiness, it has this silkiness, this seamlessness, this fineness, and it was just so graceful on the palate. It really kind of took my breath away when I was tasting it earlier. This wine has a medium weight and very, as I said, this is really about grace. It's about poise. It's about subtlety. And while there is concentration here, there's also this sense of levity and elegance and finesse. It's really quite remarkable. And maybe this is my email exchange with Jean-Claude coming through, but there's something about this wine that makes me, that I would describe as patient, if that makes any sense to anybody. It literally, the wine makes you want to pause and stop and just pause and just really kind of mull over this wine and just enjoy all of the beauty that it has, because it does have this je ne sais quoi, for lack of a better word, but it's graceful, it's elegant, it's finesse driven, and there's a thoughtfulness behind this wine, an awareness, and but yet it's still humble. And there's ease here, there's a sense of simplicity and kind of that pared down, there's no pomp and circumstance, there's no bells and whistles here, and yet there's also these layers of complexity that give you this contemplative side of the wine. So it's really doing all these different things of simplicity and ease, but also it's a wine that makes you want to pause and just ponder over it and savor it for a longer period of time. And I have to say, opening this wine today was really an emotional experience for me. I've had this wine in my cellar for some time, and maybe it's the combination of the fact that this is Cabernet Franc's birthplace. We're in Basque Country, or maybe it's the fact that Jean-Claude Berrouet and his connection with Pétrus and that whole side of things. But in any event, it was just this has been a really emotional wine for me, and it's really special. And unfortunately, it's a tough one to find, I'm not gonna lie. But I assure you, if you do come across it, don't sleep on this. Buy a bottle and enjoy the ride, because this is a really beautiful wine that deserves your attention. If you've been fortunate enough to have a bottle of the Herri Mina Irouléguy Rouge, please let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.